Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on something pretty monumental. We're synthesizing the big high-stakes assessments coming out of late 2025.
These are the reports from, the major think tanks, key defense analysts, the big financial institutions.
Exactly. And they're all focused on one thing: mapping the top geopolitical risks that are looming over 2026. And the consensus is, well, it's stark. It's not just that the world is unstable anymore.
That's the critical distinction, I think. We have to make that right at the outset. If you were listening to this kind of analysis, say, 3 or 4 years ago, the conversation was all about dealing with crises episodically.
Yeah.
One here, one there.
Right, putting out fires.
Precisely. The current analysis suggests we are way past that. We've moved into what the sources are calling a phase transition. The global system itself is now described as a fault line under strain.
A fault line under strain. That's a powerful image.
It is. And our mission in this deep dive is to really shortcut your understanding of this reorganization. We want to show you exactly why these risks are compounding and overlapping in ways that, frankly, defy traditional crisis management.
So it's no longer about that single fire. It's about recognizing that the whole global forest is, tinder dry. And every local spark, every conflagration feeds into all the others.
Yes.
Our goal today is to unpack this interlocking system. We want to move beyond just the headlines to the deep structural changes that are driving all this instability. We're looking for those aha moments that explain why the global environment isn't just frayed, but fundamentally reorganized.
And to set the context for all of that, we have to define the engine of this new instability. For what? Roughly 3 decades after the Cold War, the international order, for all its flaws, was essentially managed.
Managed by a single dominant power and, I guess, a set of stable institutions.
Exactly, but that structure is gone. It's just not there anymore. What we now inhabit is what one source calls an unmanaged multipolar landscape.
Unmanaged, that's the key word.
It is. Power is diffused, it's contested daily, and crucial alliances are constantly being tested. But the core danger here is one of velocity.
Velocity, as in speed.
The speed at which military, technological, and economic shocks travel today, that speed significantly, and I mean significantly, outpaces the ability of diplomacy or our global institutions to absorb them.
And that velocity is what makes 2026 feel so dangerous. So today we're going to explore what happens when geopolitical pressure, technological acceleration, and environmental stress all hit the accelerator at the very same time. Okay, so let's unpack this with a hard data point, one that I think really illustrates the sheer scale of the challenge we're facing. Before we get into the top 10 risks, the specific flashpoints, we have to grasp the magnitude of global conflict today. The source material highlights this one number that is, well, it's staggering. It's almost unimaginable.
It is the foundation upon which all the other risks are built. According to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the UCDP, the world recorded an astonishing 61 state-based armed conflicts in 2024.
61?
61. And this isn't just a casual finding. This is a seismic indicator of a systemic breakdown of stability.
It's a number that it's hard to get your head around without some context. 61 active state-based armed conflicts at the same time.
It absolutely requires that historical context. The analysts who compile these reports, they stress that 61, and that's defined as conflicts with at least 25 battle-related deaths per year, so these aren't minor skirmishes, is the highest number recorded since the end of World War II.
Wow. Higher than any point during the Cold War.
Think about it. The entire Cold War era, with all its proxy battles, revolutions, decolonization struggles, this current level of conflict surpasses even the bloodiest peaks of that period.
So what does that number actually tell us? What's the takeaway?
It tells us that systemic, widespread instability is not a temporary surge. It's not a blip. It is the definitive new norm of the 21st century.
So if that level of instability is the new norm, how does the nature of warfare itself change? Because when we talk about 61 wars, I get the feeling we aren't talking about 61 classic, state versus state military campaigns.
Not at all. The source material is very clear on this. Today's conflicts are incredibly complex. They're multi-layered, they blur boundaries, and they mutate constantly.
Okay, so break that down for us. What are these layers?
Well, you have the foundational category, the one we all recognize, which is traditional civil wars. These are fueled by deep internal divisions, whether they're ethnic, clan-based, or religious.
So like what we're seeing in Sudan.
The ongoing catastrophic situation in Sudan is a perfect, if brutal, example. You have the military and the rapid support forces fighting for control. That's a classic civil war that has created a massive, almost incomprehensible internal refugee crisis.
And those civil wars, I imagine they often spiral into something else.
They do. They often generate insurgencies. And these are driven less by national flags and more by, well, fundamental needs. Things like ideology, a sense of marginalization, or, and this is a growing factor, desperate resource competition.
I'm thinking of places like the Niger Delta, where deep poverty fuels armed groups, or some of the motivations for groups operating in the Sahel.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that territorial disputes, which often leverage nationalism to gain popular support. You see this in the ongoing tensions in the South China Sea, for example, or the disputed borders between Venezuela and Guyana.
Okay, so civil wars, insurgencies, territorial disputes. What's the last piece?
The last piece is the most difficult for policymakers to grapple with. It's transnational violence.
And that's where the lines just completely disappear.
Completely. Transnational violence is where terrorism, organized crime, and even state interests become totally blurred. You can't tell where one ends and the other begins.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Take the Islamic State affiliates, or groups like JNIM in West Africa. They operate across porous borders, they exploit local grievances, they use resource exploitation, illegal mining, smuggling, to fund their operations.
So they're not really a state, but they act like one in some ways.
They effectively turn local disputes into these regional infernos that no single government has the capacity or the resources to control. And this is crucial. This chaos is not accidental.
What do you mean?
Great powers often treat these fragmented conflicts as proxy arenas.
A Cold War term, making a comeback.
A huge comeback. They're supplying weapons, funding, intelligence, political cover, all while maintaining this fiction of non-involvement.
And that dynamic, that has to be the most damning indictment of this unmanaged multipolar landscape you mentioned earlier. The chaos spreads because the major players are actually facilitating it, but they avoid the direct consequences themselves.
That is the very definition of risks traveling faster than diplomacy. I mean, when the interests of Moscow, Beijing, Washington, and Tehran all overlap in a place like Syria or Libya, the local conflict is no longer solvable locally. It becomes a persistent regional problem that's being kept on life support by external oxygen.
So if we were to look at the atlas of instability that the sources provide, where is this fire most concentrated? We need to understand the geography of this new systemic risk.
Africa remains the indisputable epicenter. It's hosting approximately 28 of those 61 conflicts.
Almost half.
Almost half. And the critical thing to note here isn't just the sheer quantity of wars, it's their interconnectedness. Porous borders, shared climate stress, arms trafficking, all of this ensures that a conflict in one nation instantly spills over into its neighbors. It's a mosaic of collapsing states, internal strife, and relentless jihadist insurgencies.
And the human cost here is just. It's utterly catastrophic. The sources highlighted the long-running Somali civil war. It's been raging since 1991.
Over 1 million cumulative lives lost.
1 million. And even now, in 2025, it's still recorded over 10,000 battle-related deaths. That just shows the sheer difficulty of achieving any kind of finality in these modern conflicts.
Oh, look at the complexity in Sudan. It is not just the 2023 civil war, which has tragically resulted in over 1.4 million deaths and massive displacement. That's fighting alongside the decades-long, structurally unresolved Darfur conflict.
So it's twin wars in one country.
Twin wars tearing apart the very fabric of the country. Then you have the DRC's Kivu conflict. This is a conflict that over the past 3 decades has claimed millions, and not just through direct violence, but through the famine, displacement, and disease that follow in its wake.
And we're seeing this accelerate, right? The instability in the Sahelian jihadist belt, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, that's demonstrating a terrifying speed of governance collapse.
It is. Coups are happening faster than any regional or international body can stabilize the outcome, and that leaves this massive vacuum for that transnational violence we talked about just pour in.
It's a feedback loop.
A vicious feedback loop. Instability generates resource scarcity, which generates migration, which generates further insecurity, which then accelerates state dissolution. These aren't just isolated events, they are symptoms of a systemic regional failure.
Okay, let's shift east to Asia. Here, the sources say we find a different risk profile. It's a complex mixture of these deeply embedded internal wars and, at the same time, acute nuclear flashpoints where great powers are literally peering over the brink.
Asia accounts for about 17 of the conflicts, and it marries these decades-old insurgencies with very modern geopolitical tensions. You see the persistence of long wars like the Myanmar Civil War, which has intensified dramatically since the 2021 coup. That's created a massive humanitarian and governance crisis right on China's border.
And there are ongoing internal challenges too, right?
Absolutely. Something like the Naxalite Maoist insurgency in India. This is a conflict that has spanned nearly 6 decades. It's resulted in over 80,000 cumulative deaths since 1967.
6 decades.
It's a sobering reminder that some of these wars are generational conflicts. They absorb massive state resources without any clear end in sight.
So the stability of the entire region is being eroded from within, while at the same time, the major geopolitical fault lines, the Taiwan Strait, the India-Pakistan border, are being tested from without. It's like death by 1,000 cuts and death by a single catastrophic miscalculation, both happening at once.
That's the perfect way to put it. The great power of brinkmanship in Asia elevates the risk from tragic to potentially civilization altering. And the institutions designed to prevent this scale of global escalation, the UN Security Council, arms control regimes, they are paralyzed by the very multipolar dynamics they're supposed to manage.
So if instability is metastasizing faster than our institutions can cope, and the great powers are actually contributing to the fragmentation by using these conflicts as proxy arenas, well, the logical next step is to examine the rivalries that are creating the biggest fault lines.
Yeah.
So let's pivot to the two core structural conflicts that the sources say will define 2026. The sources are unanimous on this point. 2026 will be dominated by two massive, interconnected structural contests. And we have to start with risk one, the U.S.-China strategic rivalry. Analysts are no longer just calling this a competition.
No, the phrase that keeps coming up is the operating system of global politics.
The operation system.
And that phrase really captures the ubiquity of this rivalry. It is not an occasional disagreement. It is the default condition that now dictates global trade rules, technological standards, security alliances, and supply chain choices across nearly every single industry.
And the prediction is that by 2026, this competition will become significantly harder.
Harder, more technological, and more geographically defined.
And here's where, for me, it gets really interesting. It's the shift from a commercial rivalry to the strategic weaponization of technology. We are so far past simple trade disputes.
We are. The sources state this clearly. Technology is now treated less like commercial goods to be traded for efficiency and more like strategic assets that are vital for national survival and military superiority.
So what technologies are we talking about specifically?
We're talking about foundational, dual-use technologies, artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, particularly those below the 7-nanometer node quantum computing, and robotics.
So China's goal here is self-reliance.
It's seen as essential national security. They're moving aggressively to build parallel domestic chip supply chains, developing indigenous operating systems, and nurturing their own advanced AI ecosystems. They're signaling an undeniable intent to create alternative, non-Western dependent strategic sectors.
And the U.S. response to that is what? The sources describe it as highly targeted and coercive.
It is. It's essentially weaponizing access to core technology. So we're talking about highly specific export restrictions on advanced manufacturing tools, the machines that make the chips. These restrictions don't just aim to slow China down, they aim to choke off its highest-end military and AI capabilities.
And it's not just about restricting access.
No. The U.S. is also aggressively shaping standards in key emerging areas, effectively forming a technological perimeter to contain China's access to the most advanced intellectual property and production platforms.
So what's the consequence of this tech war?
The consequence is an accelerating, deep economic bifurcation. The world is structurally drifting toward two separate technological and economic orders.
Two separate ecosystems.
Exactly. On one side, you have China dominating downstream technologies, electric vehicles, battery storage, mass-scale robotics, consumer electronics, leveraging its massive scale and manufacturing efficiency.
And on the other side?
On the other, the U.S. is reinforcing its dominance in core fundamental platforms. It's controlling the foundational intellectual property, the high-end design software, and the most advanced lithography tools needed for the next leap in computing.
And every multinational company is caught in the middle.
Every single one is being forced to choose between optimizing for efficiency in the Chinese market and complying with the security standards of the Western order. You can't do both anymore.
The structural tension, it creates these massive risks around what the sources call flashpoints and miscalculation. And the two big ones are always the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea.
They remain the most dangerous wildcards. Now, a full-scale invasion of Taiwan is not the analyst's base case for 2026.
Okay, that's important.
It is. But the risk of a limited coercive military escalation is profoundly high.
We need to define what that limited escalation actually looks like on the ground, or I guess in the water.
Right. So we are talking about potential scenarios like a prolonged, highly coercive quarantine or blockade of Taiwan, or massive air and naval exercises that effectively shut down critical shipping lanes in the region for weeks at a time.
And what about the South China Sea?
There, the risk is a serious, unintentional kinetic clash involving U.S. allies like the Philippines, a dispute over a reef, a fishing vessel that spirals out of control.
And the global consequences of even a limited event there would be.
What? Immediate and disproportionate. Catastrophic, really. You would see an immediate disruption to major global shipping routes. Insurance markets would instantly freeze up or spike premiums to exponential levels.
And commodity prices.
Commodity prices, particularly for energy and electronics components like advanced chips, would soar to unprecedented levels. This is where that systems competition intersects with physical geography. And the danger isn't just the conflict itself, it's the lack of established guardrails.
No off-ramps.
No off-ramps.
Yeah.
Both sides are fielding increasingly advanced long-range capabilities, and the escalation ladders are poorly mapped. That just increases the probability of a miscalculation that spirals out of control and spirals rapidly.
Okay, now let's shift our focus to the other great structural rivalry that's defining the year. Risk 2. Russia-Ukraine. A war without an off-ramp. As this conflict approaches its fourth year, the sources suggest 2026 will be defined by endurance.
Endurance and attritional grinding, rather than any kind of decisive breakthrough or a negotiated resolution.
Why is that? Why no off-ramp?
The maximalist positions remain locked in place. Ukraine cannot and will not accept a loss of sovereignty or territory. And from Moscow's perspective, they cannot accept defeat after the immense cost in blood and treasure that has already been incurred.
So this dynamic just ensures the conflict remains an attritional grind, a test of resilience.
Military, economic, and political resilience. But Russia is increasingly attempting to widen the scope of the conflict through intensified gray zone warfare.
Let's delve into that concept, the gray zone, because it's the primary vector for interaction between Russia and NATO right now. What does that subtle war actually look like?
Gray zone warfare is specifically designed to achieve strategic goals, to degrade your enemy's will and capacity, without crossing the threshold that would automatically trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty.
So hit them without giving them a clear reason to hit back with full force.
That's it, exactly. On the ground, it manifests as intensified cyber attacks targeting European infrastructure, critical power grids, logistics hubs, financial systems. We're also seeing sophisticated sabotage operations against energy infrastructure, pipelines, undersea cables, and critically, a deluge of disinformation campaigns aimed at fracturing political cohesion and public will within key European supporting nations.
And the most dangerous aspect of this whole stratagem is the risk of an inadvertent kinetic clash, right?
Absolutely. As Russia pushes the boundaries through these gray zone activities, the probability of an accidental or unintended clash with NATO members, particularly in the Baltic region or bordering Eastern Europe, rises significantly.
What kind of accident are we talking about?
A misidentified drone that gets shot down over NATO territory, a sabotage operation that goes wrong and causes casualties, a border incident that escalates. These are the low-probability, high-impact events that could rapidly spiral.
And the long-term consequences of this protracted war are already hitting the heart of European stability.
They are. The sources note persistent, subdued economic growth across the continent, inflation that's fueled partly by energy insecurity, and the necessitated rise in defense spending, which is a massive drain on public budgets that could be going elsewhere.
And that economic pain feeds into politics.
It inevitably feeds populist and nationalist movements across the continent. Political paralysis is becoming a major problem in core supporting states like France and Germany, and that limits their ability to respond decisively to both the war and their own internal economic pressures.
And this is why the analysts are warning that, and I'm quoting here, security assumptions no longer hold across Europe.
The fundamental post-Cold War framework of stability is visibly fraying. We are seeing secondary flashpoints emerge that confirm this instability.
Like where?
Heightened tensions between Poland and Belarus involving border security and migrant flows. Renewed maritime disputes between two NATO members, Turkey and Greece, in the Aegean Sea. Europe is navigating a full-scale land war and, at the same time, a dissolution of its fundamental security architecture.
And this just highlights how interconnected these two structural rivalries are. The pressure from the Russia-West conflict drains resources and attention.
Which in turn frees up strategic space for the U.S.-China rivalry to harden elsewhere, and vice versa. It's a global zero-sum game being played out across multiple theaters.
That constant interaction, that feeling of strategic exhaustion, that's what defines the 2026 environment.
It is. And that brings us perfectly to our next section, because the nature of that rivalry is increasingly fought not with sheer troop numbers, but with technological systems that accelerate risk at an incredible pace.
The US-China and Russia-West rivalries aren't just geopolitical anymore. They're becoming existential tests of technological superiority. The sources are revealing that the next phase of conflict will focus heavily on systems. Specifically, what technologies allow actors to gain leverage without triggering a full-scale conventional war.
Right.
And this takes us directly to risk 5, cyber warfare and AI weaponization, which is reshaping really the global grammar of power.
It's a fundamental shift in targeting philosophy.
Hmm.
If you look back at the 20th century, wars were predominantly fought over territory. You wanted to seize and hold ground. The analysis for the 21st century suggests conflicts are increasingly fought over systems.
What do you mean by systems?
The critical digital and physical infrastructure that underpins modern society. Think power grids, financial transaction networks, global ports, satellite communication infrastructure. These are the new high-value target sets.
And the major appeal of, say, an AI-enabled cyber attack is its strategic placement. It sits below the traditional threshold of conventional war.
Exactly. It allows a state to inflict significant real-world, kinetic-style damage disrupting logistics, crippling financial institutions, causing widespread blackouts, while plausibly denying direct responsibility, or at least minimizing the risk of an immediate, overwhelming military retaliation.
So this systemic competition, it's fueling a race.
A race for sovereign AI capabilities. Analysts are reporting that major states are now treating advanced data centers, specialized AI chips, and proprietary machine learning models as the most critical national security assets. They're essentially weaponizing the entire technological stack.
The goal being what?
The focus is on achieving tactical and strategic advantages through automation and rapid decision superiority on the battlefield and in the political arena.
But this massive technological focus also introduces a financial vulnerability that the sources were pretty keen to highlight.
Yes, we've seen this incredible, almost irrational exuberance in the AI sector. It's driven massive valuations and capital flows. A major risk for 2026 is an inevitable market correction or even a major regulatory backlash in the AI sector.
So the bubble bursts.
If this capital bubble bursts, it could expose systemic financial vulnerabilities in economies that have become overly tech-heavy and highly interconnected. The entire global financial system is now, to some degree, betting on the sustained, profitable deployment of these sovereign AI capabilities.
This brings us from the digital domain back to the physical world, specifically to how these systemic competitions manifest in actual hardware. The logic of leverage using advanced missiles as arguments to shape negotiation and strategic calculus.
And we have 3 crucial case studies from the sources that demonstrate this kind of calibrated escalation: Venezuela, Taiwan, and Ukraine.
Okay, let's start with case study A, Russia's hypersonic gambit in Venezuela. This is perhaps the most audacious move reported in 2025. It directly challenges the geographic security of the United States in its own traditional sphere of influence.
Reports indicated that Moscow was supplying advanced, non-nuclear capable hypersonic missile systems, like the Oresnik to Caracas.
The comparison to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis is unavoidable.
It's unavoidable, and it's deliberate symbolism from Russia. However, the technology has fundamentally changed the risk profile. We need to explain why hypersonics are such a game changer.
Okay, so what's the difference? A missile is a missile, right?
Not at all. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles, which follow a predictable high parabolic trajectory, and arc hypersonic glide vehicles travel at more than 5 times the speed of sound, but they also maintain a high degree of maneuverability on re-entry. They can weave and dodge.
So why does that maneuverability matter so much in the context of decision time?
It dramatically, and I mean dramatically, compresses the decision-making cycle. Traditional defensive systems and radars are designed to track and predict that predictable parabolic arc. When a weapon can achieve Mach 5+ and change course mid-flight, defensive radars and missile shields have significantly less time to calculate an intercept solution.
And in the case of systems deployed in Venezuela,
They are potentially just minutes away from U.S. territory. This turns geography into an immediate psychological and strategic threat.
and Russia is explicitly framing this as a defensive, retaliatory measure for the continuous U.S. and NATO support to Ukraine. They're leveraging Venezuela as a critical pressure point, much closer to the American homeland.
It is pure escalation designed for leverage. It forces Washington to divide its strategic attention and resources. Now, if the U.S. were to consider intervention in Venezuela to remove the Maduro regime or counter this threat, the sources detail some serious complexity.
How so?
Venezuela's military is now equipped with a complex mix of sophisticated Russian, Chinese, and Iranian systems. This includes advanced anti-ship missiles and integrated air defenses.
And the analysts warned that any intervention would be, quote, trickier than Iraq. What specific logistical and military challenges are they referencing there?
They reference the dense, urbanized terrain, the likely asymmetric resistance from loyal security forces and Iranian-backed militias, and the high concentration of advanced integrated defensive systems. The risk is not a quick defeat for the Maduro regime.
The risk is getting bogged down.
The risk is prolonged instability, a major urban insurgency, and a humanitarian crisis that would destabilize the entire hemisphere for years.
So the key takeaway, according to the deep dive summary here, is that pressure without invasion remains the only viable path.
Absolutely. The recommended strategy is sophisticated, multilateral pressure. So sanctions targeting financial lifelines, diplomatic isolation, and leveraging regional allies to push Caracas toward political negotiations. Full-scale war risks entrenching the regime, guaranteeing the very proxy war that Moscow desires, and fulfilling their goal of creating prolonged destabilization on the U.S. border.
Okay, let's give it to Asia for case study B, Taiwan's straight deterrence at the edge. Here, the dynamic is almost reversed. It's the U.S. accelerating arms sales to Taiwan, including its own hypersonic systems like the Dark Eagle.
The U.S. strategy here is one of deterrence through denial. It's all about making the cost of an invasion prohibitively high for Beijing. The recently announced $10 to $11 billion defense package is focused on asymmetric capabilities.
What does that mean, asymmetric?
It means capabilities that allow a smaller force to inflict disproportionate damage on a larger one. So, highly mobile artillery, long-range strike capabilities, advanced intelligence and surveillance systems, and a massive number of drones. The goal is to destroy the invasion force before it can even establish a beachhead.
And Taiwan is contributing to this volatile deterrent structure with its own indigenous programs, highlighted by the Qingtian hypersonic cruise missile.
Right, this indigenous missile program is designed to hold high-value Chinese assets at risk. Things like the new Fujian aircraft carrier or key command and control nodes on the mainland. It forces Beijing to account for devastating retaliation, even if Taiwan's traditional defenses are breached.
This is what the sources call the deterrence paradox.
It is. You're deploying credible force to deter an attack, but you're doing so without provoking the very preemptive strike you're trying to avoid. It's a nice edge.
And the Pentagon's timeline remains sobering. They expect China to be militarily prepared for forced reunification by 2027.
And China's existing long-range missile arsenal already threatens U.S. bases all across the Pacific, which again compresses the American response time and limits the deployment flexibility of major assets like aircraft carriers.
So the goal isn't necessarily to win a war.
The key is hesitation. The goal is not victory in a full-scale war, which would likely be catastrophic for both sides, but convincing Beijing, through visible high-tech defense assets, that the use of force is simply too costly, too uncertain, and too complex to execute successfully. The stability of global supply chains, especially for semiconductors, hangs entirely on the credibility of this deterrence.
Finally, we turn to the grinding attrition of case study C, Ukraine's strategic exhaustion. The sources suggest Russia currently holds a distinct battlefield edge.
That edge is built on sheer mass. A willingness to absorb immense personnel losses, superior ammunition stockpiles, and focusing on sustained offensives to achieve incremental but persistent gains.
But Ukraine has been incredibly innovative.
They have shown remarkable adaptation through Western-supplied precision weapons and, of course, their drone warfare. But they remain fundamentally constrained by manpower shortages and the essential, non-negotiable requirement of steady Western aid.
But if Russia seems to be winning the war of attrition, the sources also note a significant underlying economic fragility within Russia itself. This isn't sustainable for them forever.
This is where endurance meets fiscal reality. While Russia has successfully insulated its economy from the immediate impact of sanctions, the long-term strain is becoming evident. Energy reserves are thinning, the budget deficit is widening, and analysts predict severe fiscal stress will begin to emerge in late 2026.
And that's because
Maintaining a maximum war posture, diverting immense resources to the defense sector, is creating structural distortions in their economy that cannot be sustained indefinitely without deep internal cost.
this fiscal stress creates the Central Western dilemma then. Increasing aid risks pushing NATO deeper into the conflict, crossing red lines for Moscow, and potentially triggering further escalation in that gray zone.
But pulling back aid risks cementing Russian gains, undermining the principle of sovereignty, and emboldening other potential aggressors globally.
So when we synthesize these three theaters, Venezuela, Taiwan, Ukraine, we see this clear pattern emerging.
A clear pattern of actors constantly probing for the middle grounds. They are attempting to define the boundary between effective pressure and catastrophic escalation. The analysis confirms that missile deployments, cyber operations, and technological signaling are the modern grammar of power. They are signals meant to shape negotiations, not necessarily trigger immediate conflict. But stability relies on careful, constant recalibration of risk by all sides.
A multipolar standoff where crises are happening simultaneously, technology is unforgiving, and the margin for error is shrinking by the day.
And that takes us perfectly into the next section, where we look at how quickly a chronic regional issue can erupt into an acute, nuclear-backed catastrophe, followed by the systemic global shocks that are compounding all these risks. So if the great power competition provides the structural background, the operating system as we called it, then South Asia provides the ultimate illustration of how quickly chronic regional tensions can spiral into an acute nuclear-backed crisis.
Right.
The sources dedicated significant space to analyzing the rapid, almost runaway escalation we saw between India and Pakistan in the spring of 2025.
The India-Pakistan relationship is, it's perpetually tense. It's defined by this deep historical grievance over Kashmir and persistent low-intensity conflict. But the sources stress that the 2025 crisis was fundamentally different.
It marked a dangerous inflection point.
Mm-hmm.
The two nations came, and this is a quote, perilously close to a broader conventional war.
And what the analysts observed was this cascading series of escalations that utilized every tool available, military, diplomatic, economic, psychological. It really exposed how fragile the deterrence equilibrium is in a nuclear-armed neighborhood.
The entire sequence was triggered by a specific violent flashpoint on April 22, 2025.
The Pahalgam attack. What happened on the ground and what was the immediate political fallout from that?
Militants ambushed a convoy of tourists in the highly sensitive Indian-administered Kashmir region. The result was the tragic deaths of 25 Indian nationals and one Nepali citizen.
And the attack was highly symbolic.
Very. It penetrated a region that India has been trying very hard to normalize as stable and secure. New Delhi immediately and very publicly accused Pakistan-based militant networks of orchestrating the attack. This applied immediate and intense political pressure for a strong response.
And Islamabad's response?
Predictably, they warned against any unsubstantiated escalation. But the political momentum within India, according to the sources, made restraint nearly impossible. This led to a dramatic, unprecedented retaliation that crossed a major psychological boundary.
This was the weaponization of water.
This was the Rubicon. India's dramatic announcement that it would suspend participation in the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty, the IWT.
For our listeners, can you explain why that treaty is so important? It's more than just a piece of paper.
It's one of those remarkable diplomatic achievements of the 20th century. It was signed after partition, and it governs how the 6 rivers of the Indus Basin are shared. It allocates the eastern rivers to India and the western rivers, which are vital for Pakistan's entire agrarian economy, to Pakistan.
So it's essentially a peace treaty for water that has survived multiple wars and crises since 1960.
Exactly. It was considered sacrosanct. By threatening sustained disruption of those river flows, the economic lifeblood of Pakistan's agriculture and resource stability, India was effectively treating water security as an act of war. It elevated the crisis far beyond traditional border skirmishes.
And the diplomatic collapse that followed was instantaneous and severe.
The situation rapidly metastasized into a full diplomatic freeze. India expelled the Pakistani ambassador, revoked visas, and shut down key border crossings.
And Pakistan retaliated.
In kind. They suspended bilateral trade, they banned all Indian aircraft from their airspace, and they recalled their own military advisors. The region immediately entered that frightening pattern we identified earlier. Hardened, non-negotiable rhetoric, frozen communication channels, and fully mobilized military forces moving into forward positions.
This geopolitical simmer then reached a boil just a couple of weeks later. This led to the 4-day war from May 7th to May 10th, 2025.
Right.
What were the specific military actions that characterized this conflict? Because it wasn't a full-scale invasion.
No, but it was the most intense and strategically significant military exchange in over 2 decades. India initiated highly accurate precision missile strikes against alleged terrorist camps, training centers, and key logistical hubs deep within Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir.
So that demonstrated a new willingness to strike at strategic
A
depth.
huge new willingness.
Yeah.
And Pakistan retaliated aggressively. They utilized drone swarms, launched their own missile salvos, and activated their sophisticated air defense systems all along the line of control. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides, primarily focused on military targets, but inevitably affecting civilians near the strike zones.
And crucially, both countries placed their strategic nuclear forces on heightened alert. This was, as the sources termed it, deterrence theater played out on a global stage with very real-world stakes.
It was a highly fraught signaling mechanism. The nuclear alert was primarily intended to demonstrate resolve and the gravity of the crisis to the international community and to the adversary. It was a warning that further escalation might breach the nuclear threshold.
But the fact that they felt compelled to do it.
The fact that they did it showed how completely events had outrun control. It showed how short the path from an attack like Pahalgam to nuclear signaling had become. The global alarm was deafening. It took frantic, concerted back-channel efforts involving the U.S., China, and influential Gulf nations to broker a fragile ceasefire on May 10th.
So they averted what could have quickly become a broader conventional war.
For the moment, crisis management achieved a temporary halt, but it did absolutely nothing to resolve the deep structural fault lines.
So what are the key factors that guarantee a replay of this kind of acute brinkmanship in 2026?
First and foremost is Kashmir itself. It's the core territorial and emotional wound. India views its sovereignty over the region as non-negotiable. Pakistan ties its national identity and its claim directly to Muslim self-determination. This is a perpetual source of conflict.
But the addition of water politics is the truly destabilizing new element. In a climate-stressed world, water is now a weapon.
Precisely. In a region that's already grappling with massive population growth, extreme heat, and glacial retreat, water has transitioned from a shared resource governed by a treaty to a high-leverage security concern and a direct trigger for war. The threat to the IWT undermines decades of fragile confidence-building measures and raises the stakes to an existential level for millions of people.
And then there's the crucial complicating factor of China.
Beijing's massive economic investment, particularly through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, and its deep military and technological support to Pakistan, even if it's formally described as neutral, has fundamentally altered the regional balance of power.
How does India see that?
India views this increasing reliance on Beijing as the formation of a de facto China-Pakistan strategic axis. It transforms the traditional bilateral rivalry into a much more dangerous triangular contest where external powers are permanently embedded in the escalation dynamic.
And this leads us directly to the terrifying reality of what the sourcing calls shortening escalation ladders. With roughly 170 nuclear warheads on each side, deterrence theory relies on rational calculation. But the 2025 crisis, sure how easily that can be bypassed.
The crisis highlighted that the introduction of modern capabilities, precision strikes, drone swarms, sophisticated cyber operations, and high-speed information warfare, all of these compressed decision timelines catastrophic.
The ODO loop gets shorter and shorter.
Exactly. The speed of retaliation accelerates, the window for diplomacy shrinks from days to mere hours, and the fog of war is magnified by information asymmetry. In this highly compressed timeline, accidental escalation or just reckless decision-making under duress becomes far more likely. The sustained back-channel diplomacy that led to the ceasefire must be reinforced in 2026 if the world hopes to avoid another such near catastrophe.
It is a profound lesson that regional volatility, when you layer it with nuclear capability and great power involvement, creates a systemic risk that the global community is just ill-equipped to handle.
It is.
Now, let's broaden our view to the global systemic pressures that affect every nation, starting with the Middle East.
Having covered the structural rivalries and the acute flashpoints, we now need to sweep the horizon for the pervasive systemic risks that are constantly feeding the instability we've discussed. These are the underlying forces of fragmentation. And we begin with risk 3, the Middle East on the edge of regional war.
And the source material rightly described the region not as a single crisis, but as a cluster of interlinked fires.
That's a very apt description. And the high probability of acute instability seems centered around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, specifically Gaza and the West Bank.
What's the assessment there?
The assessment is that renewed major conflict in Gaza remains highly probable. This would generate devastating humanitarian fallout and guaranteed regional reverberations, forcing neighbors like Egypt and Jordan into very difficult political positions.
And at the same time, the West Bank.
The West Bank remains a pressure cooker. Continued settlement expansion, combined with the profound political disenfranchisement among the Palestinian population, guarantees sustained internal unrest that could easily spill into broader confrontations.
But the existential risk for the region, and the one that directly impacts global markets, is the Iran-Israel confrontation.
This is the most alarming vector. Iran's consistent advancement of its nuclear program, reducing its breakout time to get a weapon, combined with its strategic efforts to rebuild and rearm its extensive proxy network across the region.
Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Syria and Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen.
All of them. This raises the stakes dramatically. Analysts suggest that a limited strike by either side, whether a preemptive strike by Israel on a nuclear facility or an overwhelming missile response from Iran's proxies, could quickly cascade into a broader regional war.
And what does that cascading conflict look like geographically? Who gets pulled in?
It immediately involves Lebanon, where Hezbollah holds immense missile stockpiles. It involves Syria, which is a critical Iranian land bridge. And it involves the various militia groups in Iraq.
And the Gulf nations.
The conflict would put immense pressure on them, particularly those that have normalized relations with Israel. It would force them to choose sides and could potentially destabilize the entire Gulf security architecture.
And the global consequence of this is inherently tied to the world's dependence on fossil fuels.
A regional war that physically threatens the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point for roughly a third of the world's seaborne oil, or that directly attacks major oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf, would instantly trigger a global economic shock.
It would force a shift in priorities.
It would force countries worldwide to implement deep energy nationalism. That means securing immediate, affordable, and local supply over any long-term climate-first policies. The climate agenda would instantly become subordinate to immediate geopolitical necessity.
And we can't forget the maritime flashpoints that are already impacting global commerce. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea have already demonstrated how a single non-state actor, backed by a state patron, can severely disrupt key global shipping lanes,
Forcing insurance and logistics costs through the roof and threatening just-in-time supply chains. The Middle East is a unique ecosystem where non-state actors possess state-level military power, and that instability immediately translates into global economic risk.
Okay, moving now from security to the economic architecture of the world. We confront risk 6, trade protectionism and economic fragmentation. The sources suggest that global trade governance is basically flipping its primary purpose.
It's a fundamental reversal of the globalization dynamic that defined the last 4 decades. Trade is no longer purely driven by lowest cost and efficiency. It is driven by security logic.
Security logic.
Governments are explicitly prioritizing control, redundancy, and national security of supply over traditional cost-effectiveness models.
And what are the specific tools of fragmentation being used? It's not just simple, broad tariffs anymore, is it?
No, the tools are becoming increasingly sophisticated and surgical. We're talking about targeted tariffs, of course, but also highly restrictive export controls, like those on advanced chips. We're seeing complex local content rules that mandate production within national borders, and huge subsidies designed to attract manufacturing away from adversarial countries.
And everyone's doing it.
The US, the EU, and China are all employing these tools aggressively. And the result is a world that's drifting away from a single, integrated global market toward managed blocks, defined by political alignment.
This is the era of friendshoring.
Exactly. Investment, trade, and capital flows are increasingly moving exclusively between allied or trusted nations. Now, while this increases domestic resilience in the short term, the macroeconomic consequence is profound.
Which is?
Higher costs for manufactured goods, persistent structural inflation, and slower overall global economic growth due to reduced efficiency and the duplication of supply chains.
And the sources noted that finance itself is becoming politicized.
Yes, financial systems, which were once seen as purely neutral conduits, are now being used as instruments of influence and geopolitical coercion. We see this in the weaponization of debt, where strategic lending creates dependency, and in the manipulation of capital flows and currencies to reward allies or punish rivals. The separation between economic policy and national security policy is functionally dissolving.
Let's pivot to the environmental and technological overlap, which forms risk 7, resource scarcity and climate divergence. This is where the climate crisis collides directly with great power competition.
It's a competition for the inputs of the future economy. We are seeing intensifying global competition over critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, manganese, and rare earths.
The things you need for both the green transition and for defense.
They are non-negotiable for both the clean energy transition, EV batteries, solar panels, and for advanced defense technology like precision missiles and guidance systems.
And China's dominance in specific supply chains makes this a critical geopolitical vulnerability, doesn't it?
Absolutely. China currently controls significant portions of the processing and refinement capacity for rare earths. These are minerals that are essential for high-tech manufacturing. This creates a leverage point that could be weaponized in a systemic rivalry, making the diversification of these supply chains an urgent security matter for the U.S. and its allies.
And meanwhile, the physical impact of climate change is driving political decisions. Climate shocks, extreme heat waves, catastrophic floods, prolonged droughts are forcing countries to prioritize immediate survival over emissions targets.
This creates the core divergence. Countries are forced to prioritize domestic resilience and immediate energy security, often reverting to reliable, if polluting, sources over adherence to long-term emissions reduction targets. The sources conclude that in 2026, the global climate agenda will be decisively subordinated to geopolitical necessities.
And that raises the risk of climate-induced conflict and further instability in vulnerable regions that can no longer cope with the shocks.
Yes, and that constant pressure then manifests in risk 8, emerging market instability. This is where all these fragilities collide, creating pressure points for great power competition. Let's look at Latin America first, going beyond just the missile gambit in Venezuela.
What's the broader risk there?
The broader risk centers on potential escalation if external operations aimed at transnational criminal networks inadvertently destabilize fragile governments. For instance, the ongoing tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela could escalate if operations targeting drug trafficking or migrant routes are perceived by the Maduro regime as an attempt at destabilization. The risk of inadvertent state collapse is high.
Which leads back to that prolonged insurgency scenario we discussed earlier.
Exactly. And in Africa, we see the cumulative effects of food insecurity, resource conflicts, and the spillover from those 61 wars we mentioned at the start.
Africa remains highly vulnerable.
Fragile states are struggling under the weight of simultaneous challenges: severe food insecurity exacerbated by climate change and conflict, persistent insurgencies, particularly the metastasizing jihadist threat in the Sahel, and acute resource conflicts. The regional spillovers from crises like Sudan, with millions displaced, create massive internal and external pressures.
And these regions become prime targets for exploitation.
Precisely. Great powers and non-state actors alike seek to gain influence by providing selective security or resources. This fragmentation is creating geopolitical vacuums.
Finally, we have to turn inward to the domestic dynamics that are affecting global stability. Risk 9 and 10, focusing on domestic erosion and non-state power. Let's start with risk 9, domestic U.S. polarization.
This is a risk that transcends borders because the United States remains the linchpin of the post-war global order.
Right.
Rising intractable political polarization and internal unrest within the U.S. severely handicaps its ability to act as a consistent, credible global leader.
How does internal polarization translate into foreign policy risk?
It translates into unpredictability and paralysis. Allies question the longevity of U.S. commitments, whether treaty obligations, trade agreements, or aid packages, because a domestic political swing could reverse them instantly. It also slows down decision-making in critical moments of global crisis, which just amplifies uncertainty everywhere else. Yeah. When the world's most powerful stabilizing force is internally distracted or divided, it creates a vacuum that rivals are eager to exploit.
And the sources noted that ideas that were once considered fringe-like cross-border military action against drug cartels in Mexico are now seriously entering the mainstream political debate.
That is a huge indicator of how escalating internal tensions, specifically the frustration stemming from the chaos at the borders and the drug crisis, are now driving foreign policy discussions. This reflects a dangerous trend toward using unilateral force to address transnational problems, which increases the risk of conflict with neighbors who view such actions as unacceptable violations of sovereignty.
This domestic erosion ties directly into risk 10, organized crime and non-state power. In a world of weak states and transactional geopolitics, organized crime thrives. It effectively functions like an insurgency.
These groups are no longer just criminal enterprises. They are sophisticated, militarized entities that challenge the state's monopoly on violence, exploiting blurred borders and governance vacuums. The scale of this non-state power is terrifying.
The sources quantified this with devastating effect. The Mexican drug war has claimed over 127,000 deaths. That's a fatality count that rivals conventional interstate wars.
And that's just one example. We see Haiti's near-total state collapse under the control of gang federations, which are essentially running major infrastructure and population centers. We also see the explosion of cartel violence in Ecuador, which has rapidly transformed a previously stable country into a security crisis zone.
And these groups are harder to manage than states.
Much harder, because they lack a single identifiable center of gravity. They use technology, violence, and economic leverage to create transnational security threats.
And the ultimate high-impact, low-probability risk remains a major terrorist attack by a well-organized non-state actor.
An attack capable of inflicting mass casualties or disrupting critical infrastructure would immediately reshape political agendas globally. It would almost certainly accelerate authoritarian responses, increase state surveillance, and further erode public trust in democratic institutions to provide basic security. This risk sits right at the intersection of domestic erosion and transnational violence.
We have covered 10 interlocking risks, spanning the technological, economic, environmental, military, and domestic political spheres. The conclusion is inescapable. The global system isn't just facing challenges, it is fundamentally transforming its geometry. So we've mapped out this new geometry of risk. For you, the listener, navigating this environment as a decision maker, an investor, or just a well-informed citizen, what is the crucial synthesis from all these sources? The defining feature of 2026 is the way these crises interlock.
That is the ultimate takeaway. These risks are not independent variables. You cannot solve them in isolation. Trade tensions amplify security fears in places like the Taiwan Strait.
Right.
Climate shocks, droughts, floods worsen political instability in already fragile states in Africa or South Asia. Technological rivalry fuels economic fragmentation and accelerates military escalation in places like Venezuela. Power is increasingly decentralized, deterrence is highly uncertain, and shocks propagate across the entire system faster than any institution can respond.
We are in a world where complexity and velocity are the default settings. The sources are definitive about the necessary strategy moving forward, and this isn't just for governments. It's for businesses and investors trying to maintain viability.
The core strategy cannot be based on trying to predict the next crisis. That's a fool's errand. It must be resilience.
Resilient.
Resilience means building organizational systems that can absorb inevitable shocks and maintain function. This includes structurally diversifying your supply chains away from single geographic or political points of failure. It means establishing robust cybersecurity protocols against sophisticated gray zone attacks.
And planning.
Engaging in rigorous and continuous geopolitical scenario planning that accounts for these cascading risks. And critically, maintaining sustained, quiet diplomatic engagement, even with rivals, to ensure those shortening escalation ladders do not get snipped completely.
So the world is not ending.
No.
But it is reorganizing. It is transitioning away from the structure that defined the last 30 years and moving into something far more fluid and contested.
Precisely. Those who insist on operating with the assumptions of a unipolar world, relying on globalization for efficiency above all else, or believing that institutions like the UN can manage core rivalries, they may find themselves navigating not just uncertainty, but rapid and profound irrelevance. Adaptability to this new geometry of risk is the central survival tool for 2026 and beyond.
That brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you digest this massive shift. The current global governance institutions, the UN Security Council, the WTO, the various arms control regimes, they were built for a post-1945 or a post-Cold War world. Given that violence metastasizes faster than diplomacy in this unmanaged multipolar landscape, and given the dangerous shortening of escalation ladders we saw between nuclear powers like India and Pakistan, what single-focused reform to a major global institution, not a broad overhaul, but one critical change, what would be most effective in curbing this accelerated pace of crisis and restoring a margin for diplomatic error? Something to mull over as you begin charting your own course through the new geometry of risk.